Alright, I'm late.
As part of this campaign, the Public Health Service launched 6 pilot projects in the South in predominantly poor black communities. These efforts were partially supported by state and philanthropic funds. One project was in Macon County, Alabama. In 1930, government doctors arrived with high hopes and an ambitious plan to diagnose and treat as many as 10,000 people. Effective therapy would require an arduous and sometimes painful course of treatment with toxic compounds administered over a year and a half. Initial blood testing revealed an epidemic rate of syphilis in Macon County. 35% of the black men and women here were infected. But the Public Health Service had underestimated the costs of providing treatment to so many. And they hadn't counted on the Great Depression lasting so long. By the end of 1931, there was not enough money to continue the program. Of the thousands infected, the Public Health Service had treated only 1,400. And of these, many did not receive the full course of therapy. The government doctors pulled out, leaving the men and women here to the mercy of the disease. But this was not to be the end of the Macon County Syphilis Project. Back in Washington, Public Health Service officials were anxious to salvage some scientific benefit from the abandoned program. The head of the VD division, Talifer Clark, had a plan. If there was not enough money for a costly treatment campaign, perhaps there were funds for less expensive research. He proposed Macon County as the ideal site for a 6-month study of untreated syphilis. Clark wrote,
Macon County is a natural laboratory, a ready-made situation. The rather low intelligence of the Negro population, depressed economic conditions, and the very common promiscuous sex relations not only contribute to the spread of syphilis, but also to the prevailing indifference with regard to treatment.
Clark proposed to investigate whether syphilis was the same disease in blacks and in whites. The question emerged from theories that there were fundamental genetic and physical differences between the races.
When you look at many of the medical writings at the turn of the century, especially those of white physicians and nurses and public health experts, the focus is on genetics, that somehow that black people were inherently syphilitic, that black people were inherently tuberculous, that black people had smaller brains, and because they had smaller brains, they couldn't control their lust. They were immoral.
There was also a widely held belief that syphilis in blacks was not a deadly disease. Clark hoped that debunking this would free up new funds for treatment programs. He knew he needed local help to implement his plan, and he turned to Macon County's brightest light, the Tuskegee Institute. Founded by Booker T. Washington to educate freed slaves and their descendants, the school had garnered the trust of the local community and the respect of the nation. Tuskegee was committed to the health needs of blacks and had a well-equipped hospital, laboratories, and a highly trained medical staff, all the facilities needed for a research study. And here was a major research project, an unparalleled scientific opportunity. At least that's the way the designers of the experiment described it. For its part, the school had long depended on the moral support and financial backing of the federal government. So when the Public Health Service came asking for help, it was difficult to say no. In the autumn of 1932, the university agreed to collaborate, and the syphilis treatment program was transformed into a scientific study designed to collect data. And the men of Macon County were changed unwittingly from patients to experimental subjects. No voice was raised in protest, no questions asked about the welfare or the rights of the men.
For the greater part of the 20th century, we assumed that what physicians and scientists were doing was morally responsible and conscientious, and we didn't really ask about it.
Possible death or liberty. This is the risk 10 convicts are volunteering to take in the fight against sleeping sickness.
We're doing this for the sake of humanity.
In the 30s, there were no regulations to ensure that subjects were fully informed about experiments or protected from unnecessary risks. This study was designed to investigate sleeping sickness.
The test begins. In glass tubes with gauze at the ends are mosquitoes which were fed on victims of the St. Louis epidemic. Will their bite affect these men? That is science's question.
Can you feel a mosquito biting?
Yes, ma'am.
Research subjects will most likely come from those who are in some ways not only medically disadvantaged, but socially disadvantaged in one way or another. And therefore, the burden of human experimentation historically has often rested on those who are in some manner least able to protect themselves from this kind of investigation.
In the Macon County experiment, the subjects were found through the two institutions they trusted most, church and school. Herman Shaw heard about a chance to become a special government patient.
The way I heard about it was through a rumor that the people, and this came out of Macon County, and people said that you could get free medicine for yourself and things of that kind. And it would have a meeting at Spinal Chapter at a certain date. And those of us who were eligible, was of a certain age, well then it had to be a certain age to be eligible to participate in this meeting. Therefore, I went. Well, that's that afternoon when we went over there. Well, then they said that we'd get free medicine, wouldn't cost us anything. And the doctor would get free doctor.
The doctors said they had come to cure bad blood.
When it first started up, you see, I didn't know nothing, just a country boy. As they say, when they got out here in Alabama, they found what they wanted. Just went to doctoring on us and said he's going to treat us. And they just said bad blood.
Bad blood was a euphemism. It could have meant syphilis. It could have meant tired blood. So that bad blood meant lots of different things. It was not what one would call a very concise term. But the point is, the men were told that they had something wrong with them and that they were being treated for their bad blood.
With promises of free treatment for bad blood, the doctors recruited 400 men never before treated, and now in the later stages of syphilis. Much was already known about the natural history of this disease. Syphilis is most contagious in the first weeks and months, and is spread sexually and congenitally from mother to fetus. In its early stages, rashes, headaches, fevers, and pain are common. Then syphilis enters a symptomless latency period which lasts from months to decades, and for a lucky minority, never ends. But for the majority, there will be a relapse, the violent storm of late syphilis. Now the disease attacks the brain, internal organs, and joints of its most unfortunate victims. As the Tuskegee Study began, the government doctors cataloged the effects of latent and late syphilis. They conducted blood tests, detailed physical exams, and x-rays. And there was one more test they wanted, a purely diagnostic spinal tap to determine the prevalence of neurological syphilis.
I'm going to locate that spot between the vertebrae in your lower back and make a small needle puncture there to withdraw some fluid. Not much to it, really.
Good.
Bend your head over. Further. Further, I said. Good. Good. Now you're going to have to sit very still. Nurse Evers will help you. Especially once that needle is inside your spinal canal. Don't move, or that needle might injure the nerves in your legs.
To my legs?
That's right. That's why we don't want you to move.
Don't worry, I'm not moving.
All right. Here we go.
You're going too far.
I have to try to find the spinal canal. All right, here we go.
That was pretty bad. That Spinal Tap. Of course, I did along pretty good with it, but I stayed in the bed a week or two.
This letter, sent to each man before his spinal tap, claimed it was a very special free treatment.
Some time ago, you were given a thorough examination, and since that time, we hope you have gotten a great deal of treatment for bad blood. You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished, you will be given a special treatment if it is believed
you are in a condition to stand there. Remember, this is your last chance for a special free treatment.
The men were told that the spinal taps were a treatment. That shows you some of the deception and deceit involved in the study. And these are physicians saying this so that it has a certain power and authority, a physician saying this.
Men from this community were told that the government doctors had come to help them. They were never informed of the real purpose of the research project. They were never told the true nature of their illness, nor the dangers they faced. According to the original proposal, the Tuskegee Study was to be finished at the end of 6 months. Instead, it was just beginning. Government doctors became fascinated by the early data. They saw indications that blacks suffered the same complications from syphilis as whites. That was exciting because it contradicted the prevailing wisdom that somehow syphilis was different and less deadly among blacks. The investigators convinced themselves that their research could answer other more general questions as well. In their mind, they thought they could break new scientific ground in the study of syphilis. Their excitement propelled them forward as the Tuskegee Study was poised to make its most fateful turn. Raymond Vanderleer, a young field officer, now played a critical role. Particularly enthralled by the science and blatantly unconcerned for the welfare of the men, he pushed to extend this study into a long-term, open-ended research project. Soon, Vanderleer was promoted to the head of the VD division and had the power himself to implement his plan. Now, preparing for the long-term study, the Public Health Service hired a Tuskegee nurse, Eunice Rivers, the inspiration for Miss Evers in the play. Rivers was to become the main liaison between Macon County and Washington, driving the back roads of rural Alabama to monitor the subjects and tend to their minor complaints. She traveled to country fairs and churches and schools to maintain contact with the men and their families. She also helped to recruit a group of controls, 200 men free of the disease. But Rivers' main responsibility was to gather the study participants for the now annual roundups when the government doctors came to town. On each subject they performed physicals and blood tests, and to maintain the appearance of treatment, the doctors gave the men placebos, vitamins, aspirins, and tonics, all useless against syphilis.
We got 3 different types of medicine. We got a round pill, and sometimes they give us a capsule, and then they would give us a little vial of liquid medicine. Everybody got the same thing.
These were men who weren't going to question the system, who weren't going to question the government doctors, who weren't going to be out there picketing and writing and protesting about it. These were men in Macon County, Alabama. Who's going to speak for them?
In the 1930s, throughout the South, legally enforced segregation maintained a system of racial hierarchy. Black people were expected to live in deference to white authority. When some of the men of the study were ordered by their employers to go for blood testing, they had little choice but to comply. The Public Health Service continued to rely upon that authority. In Miss Evers' Boys, the nurse is based on Eunice Rivers, and the character of Dr. Douglas represents Vandelier and the medical establishment.
To treat these men by mistake. This is the decision Washington has made. This study must go to endpoint.
And how far is that?
Autopsy.
Autopsy?
The facts in this study must be validated by autopsy. We're so close to unraveling.
And the Public Health Service wasn't above a bit of bribery.
Those men need our help, don't they?
Of course they do.
Would $50 be of help to those men?
$50 is a lot of money in Macon County, Dr. Douglas.
Would $50 life insurance convince those men to stay with this study?
Life insurance?
For burial.
A decent burial would mean a lot to those men. They're buried in feed sacks by the city dump.
As long as this study continues, any study patient who dies, for whatever reason, receives $50 life insurance. Washington would do that, Nurse Evers, if it would help.
In the earlier years, they gave even less.
My father-in-law was in this study, and he died early, and they gave him $35 in burial, and that was almost burial person in those days. In fact, it would. It gave you a casket, put a decent burial.
In exchange, bodies were taken to a local hospital for postmortems. Tuskegee nurse Mary Harper assisted.
We were to start off, with the autopsy, and Dr. Peters was saying, my God, it is interesting for when we saw a great deal of the spread and the devastating effect that the syphilis had on the body. He was saying, you know what, Mary, pull the clinical record for this particular patient, and we want to see to what extent does his clinical manifestation match the amount of pathology that we had found in the body. That was the thing that was very, very interesting.
As the records indicate, the autopsies sometimes revealed even more damage inside the bodies than had been expected from previous physical exams.
Once you start looking down in that body and looking at the various organs and the effects that it had, then you know it is a very, very devastating illness.
The very first autopsy was performed at the end of 1933. Over the years, many deaths were to follow this one, each dutifully noted in government reports and scientific papers.
The Tuskegee Study was almost never a secret from its very inception. And one of the most interesting and difficult aspects to account for it is the fact that periodically, starting in 1936 and then on a fairly regular basis, the results of the study's findings were reported in major medical journals.
In the early years, the findings were sometimes also reported to Congress, but no one inside the medical establishment or government questioned the merits of the study.
This was not some mad scientist in the basement doing this. That it was public information. And I think people did not raise issues about it because they didn't see anything wrong with it. The medical profession did not see anything wrong with it.
The first article was published in 1936 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The researchers reported that of their 400 subjects, 75% suffered some complications of late syphilis. Half showed cardiovascular damage, and a third had neurological symptoms. The scientists continued to find the data intriguing, and they watched and waited to see what would happen next to the men of the study. By 1937, conditions in Macon County were looking up. During a New Deal sweep through the South, FDR brought his message of hope to Tuskegee.
We're realizing more and more that it's a great privilege to be alive. Somebody said it's grand no matter how old you get to want to keep on living because there's still so much to be done.
As part of the program of national recovery, the government reasserted its public health initiatives. The Public Health Service launched a revived nationwide campaign to combat the syphilis epidemic. It was run by the principal architect of the Tuskegee Study, Raymond Vandelier.
The physician who accepts for treatment a patient with syphilis assumes a very definite
public obligation. When you accept a patient, you should likewise accept the responsibility of assuring yourself that he completes the treatment schedule.
By 1938, there was a National Venereal Disease Control Act, and throughout the nation, including Alabama, the Public Health Service pushed for syphilis treatment programs, but not for the men of Tuskegee. They were systematically excluded, and if they sought out help, they were tracked down and stopped. This happened to Herman Shaw when he went to Birmingham, Alabama for treatment.
When I got there, I saw a lady, a nurse pacing through the camp, talking about she was disturbed and thinking she'd been looking for someone that wasn't supposed to be there.
There are 2 patients in this treatment clinic who do not belong here. Is there a man here named Willie Johnson? Is there a man here named Caleb Humphreys?
Yes, I'm here. Who's here, Nurse Evans? You wearing a new hat.
What are you doing here, Willie Johnson?
See, what are you doing up here? I said, well, they told me I had to come up here. They sure you got to go to Birmingham. So she said, come here, come here.
That doctor did not know you were a government patient. If that doctor had known that, he wouldn't have sent you here. Now you get back on that bus to Tuskegee.
And they gave me breakfast and put me on the bus and sent me back to town. I said, you didn't supposed to be here. I said, you in the Macon County Clinic.
One of the remarkable aspects of the study was the lengths to which the Public Health Service went to ensure that the men never received treatment. And when some of the men, by their own design, were able to obtain treatment, this was perceived by the researchers as abrogating the study.
The world was changing, spurred on by the Second World War. But single-mindedly, the researchers ignored or circumvented each change that threatened their study. After 1941, millions of Americans were swept into the armed forces. All of them were tested for disease, and those infected with syphilis were ordered to treatment. But in Tuskegee, the scientists running the study appealed to the draft board to exclude their subjects from military service, so their syphilis would remain untreated. Study subject Charles Pollard, however, was inducted into another type of service. When the U.S. government asked him to appear in this film to promote black support for the war effort, he agreed. Pollard and his wife played the proud parents of an Army pilot, a member of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. Charles Pollard was eligible for the draft during the war, but he was never called to duty. To the U.S. government, he and the other men of the study had their own special status. As the war raised the stakes, the Public Health Service escalated its campaign to rouse the national will against syphilis. This wartime propaganda took on a decidedly moralistic tone.
Search out the places that infect the city, that infect its people. The places with the easy pickups. This is where syphilis must be fought. Search out the people, too. The people who carry the disease.
And soon these campaigns were fortified by a revolutionary medical breakthrough. The war period saw the rise of a wonder drug, penicillin.
Recognition that penicillin effectively treated syphilis had remarkable implications immediately during the war for the treatment of syphilis among American troops. But beyond that was kind of a marker that, in fact, perhaps there would be magic bullets.
By now, John Heller had replaced Von der Leer as the director of the Tuskegee Study.
More than 200,000 new infections of syphilis are acquired in this country each year. All are actually or potentially highly infectious.
On the basis of present evidence, penicillin appears to have great value in the treatment of syphilis in virtually all stages and manifestations.
Whatever the future may hold for penicillin therapy, we physicians already have in our hands weapons which, with proper medical usage, should enable us to reduce materially the amount of venereal disease in the United States.
While promoting penicillin for the nation, Heller continued the policy of denying treatment to the men in Macon County. In 1947, he published the latest findings from the study in the Journal of Venereal Disease Information.
The The life expectancy of a Negro man between 25 and 50 who is infected with syphilis and receives no treatment is reduced by about 20%. The fact that nearly twice as large a proportion of the syphilitic individuals as of the control group has died is a very striking one.
Even with undisputed evidence that men were dying, no penicillin was offered. One of the few surviving public health service doctors who worked on the study still defends that decision. John Cutler.
It was important. They were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin to treat another disease because you'd interfere with the study.
The fact that the men are denied penicillin simply reaffirms how determined the public health service is to keep this experiment going. I don't see it as a new issue. Having decided to withhold the treatment of choice in the 1930s, treatment that doctors in the 1930s said was good treatment, I don't think that there'd be any ethical dilemma for withholding penicillin when it presents itself. They'd already crossed that bridge.
If the ethics of the study had ever been unclear, the events of 1947 should have brought them into sharp focus.
Second Nuremberg trials. The American Military Tribunal hearing evidence against 23 of the leading Nazi doctors.
The Nuremberg tribunals uncovered, amid the perverse horrors of the Nazi regime, gross examples of human experimentation in the name of medical science. The trial of these Nazi doctors led the international community to formulate the Nuremberg Code for the Protection of Human Subjects. Its first and central principle was informed consent. Subjects must voluntarily agree to be part of any experiment and must be fully aware of all risks. The scientists of the Tuskegee Study, including Director John Heller, dismissed the relevance of Nuremberg.
I asked him specifically about Nuremberg and whether that gave him any pause. And he said absolutely not. I asked him if whether he ever drew any associations between what they were doing and what the Nazis had done, and he said certainly not. And then he looked at me with kind of wounded innocence and said they were Nazis.
The Nazi concentration camp experiments, because of their fiendish nature, were seen as an aberration, as something that could not happen anywhere else in the civilized world, and therefore it was relegated into a special category. But there were important lessons to be learned from Nuremberg, and those lessons were not learned.
And so the government doctors and Nurse Rivers continued their roadside roundups to observe but not treat the ever fewer survivors. Despite the many changes around them, the national campaign to treat syphilis, the advent of penicillin, the horrors exposed at Nuremberg, the researchers pushed on, undeterred. And soon there was yet another development to ignore.
It is ironic that in this county, where so much emphasis was being placed upon civil rights and the right to vote, that there could be a situation occurring that most people did not realize, where African American, rural Macon County, underprivileged, very little educated men were being taken advantage of by the federal government.
In the mid-50s, Fred Gray was an attorney for Martin Luther King at the center of the civil rights movement that exploded just 40 miles from Tuskegee in Montgomery, Alabama.
I don't even believe that the persons who started the study would have even considered using white persons instead of black. It was racially motivated, it was racially conceived. They found here a pocket of blacks who the nation really would care little or nothing about.
During the turbulent years of the civil rights movement in Alabama, the study went on. The scientists continued to ignore this new force that shook the world around them. Instead, they watched and they waited to see what would happen next to the men of the study. A decade later, in the mid-60s, The civil rights movement was in its prime, and the Tuskegee Study was almost 40 years old. The study was now managed by the Centers for Disease Control, an agency of the Public Health Service. And here, the first rumblings of concern began. A young epidemiologist learned about the study and tried to have it exposed.
We collected the studies, put them in a package, and sent them to the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on, and waited for the major break to come. Well, of course, it never came. We were fairly naive about how the media worked. I think now we would know that we should have written a press release and we should have, had the contact and we should have followed up and all that sort of stuff. But at this point, we thought all we had to do was tell America that something was wrong here and everything would be all right and everybody would understand. And everything was not all right and not everybody understood and nothing was done.
Across the country in San Francisco, the story took another critical turn. Peter Buxton was a public health service VD worker.
One day in the coffee room at work, an older associate was telling a story of a man with insanity, a black man, who was rushed by his family to a physician. His first examination probably in 20 years, other than in the study. And the physician treated him, and the physician was punished by the local medical society. I couldn't reconcile that. I thought, what is this? There's something going on here.
What was going on, as Buxton wrote in a letter to the CDC, was racism. A few months later, he was invited to Atlanta.
There was a conference that was going to be attended by the doctors, among other people, who were running the study in Tuskegee. And one of them in particular was outraged at what I had done, at what I had written.
I remember meeting Peter Buxton, and I remember my concern, my reaction to what he was proposing.
He couldn't wait until we got down the hall and into the conference room to begin lambasting me for what I had said. And it was, "See here, young man, and we're getting valuable statistics, and we need this to diagnose people who are coming in, to find out how long they've had the disease, to know how properly to treat them, etc."
We were dealing with a very important study that was going to have the long-term results of which were actually to improve the quality of care for the black community, so that these individuals were actually contributing to the work towards the improvement of the health of the black community, rather than simply serving as merely guinea pigs for the study. And of course, I was bitterly opposed to killing off the study for obvious reasons.
The group of guinea pigs was 100% black. That in itself, in the midst of the fervor of the 60s, was just a red flag. I couldn't understand people wanting to do something like that at that time.
At that time, not only was the civil rights movement in full gear, but there was a growing concern about the rights of patients and subjects of medical research. The Public Health Service itself had issued guidelines to ensure that patients could not be subjected to experimentation without their full knowledge and consent. But even those guidelines were ignored by the scientists controlling the Tuskegee Study. Finally, in 1969, under pressure from Peter Buxton and others, the CDC convened a panel, all white and all doctors, to review the study. After 3 hours of debate, the panel voted to continue the study and withhold treatment from the men. They rationalized that since the men had gone without treatment for such a long period of time, that giving them penicillin might not help anyway. At the meeting, there was just one lone voice of dissent.
My view was that they should treat all the patients and tell them what had happened as best they could, even if they didn't succeed, and even if they felt the patients wouldn't understand. I felt they owed it to all concerned to clarify what they had been doing, why they had been doing it.
If we had gone to the community and told the men that they had had syphilis and had not been treated, and that they were now still alive and healthy, and did not need any more treatment, I don't think we would have been holding out much, we would not have been providing them with anything positive. We would just have been telling them that 40, 50 years ago people did something to them, and now we're sorry.
The idea, well, the damage had been done, there's not much that could be done for the men at this point, telling them would only upset them, is a very powerful example of a paternalistic idea of both medicine and research that can be very, very damaging. And this idea that, well, we might as well continue since we've gone this far is one of the aspects of the bureaucratic inertia that really just continued to move the study forward one time after another.
I was terrified. I felt that they were in big trouble and that they were going to create a great stir, and that it would be publicized to the great disadvantage of the public health service.
In 1972, Peter Buxton gave his files to a reporter for the Associated Press. The Washington Star broke the story in July. Within weeks, the government launched an official investigation. In October of 1972, 40 years after it began and after at least 28 deaths, the Tuskegee Study was officially halted.
Well, after I found out all about it, it did make me, I might have said some curse words out by myself, but I ought to be ashamed of myself. I wouldn't have did them like that.
That's what the newspaper article was saying, Willie. That's what guinea pig means. Those men were just watching to see what that bad blood would do. That's it. She took you out of that Birmingham line, didn't she? That penicillin could have saved Ben. Hardly. Made you a dancing man. I gotta find that paper. I gotta find it and give it to my lawyer.
And he handed me the newspaper and he said, I'm Charlie Pollard in this paper. And he explained to me how he was at the stockyard a day or so before and was approached by a newspaper reporter. And he discovered as a result of that conversation that he was a part of what has become known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, and he wanted to know whether or not I could do something for him about it.
On behalf of the survivors and families of the deceased, Gray filed a lawsuit against the Public Health Service and other agencies of the U.S. government. In an out-of-court settlement, each subject received less than $38,000, a fraction of what Gray initially sought for the violation of their rights.
They had an absolute right to know, one, that it was a study, two, that they were not being treated for their ailment, three, they needed to know and had a right to know what was wrong with them. And they should have been the persons who would have given their consent, or at least exercise a choice as to whether or not they would want to or not want to be involved in the study.
It's been more than 60 years since the Tuskegee Study began, and 20 since it ended. But the echoes of Tuskegee reverberate today, and many questions still plague the scientific and medical community. What are the legacies of Tuskegee? What has been gained from the sacrifices of the men of the study? Most observers have criticized the science, noting that goals were vague and protocols flawed. Many subjects received some treatment for their syphilis, either sporadic doses of mercury and arsenic in the early days, or antibiotics given by doctors outside the study for other infections. Record keeping was sloppy, and men in the control group who became infected were even switched into the study group.
My regret is, in terms of the study, I have none. As a scientist, and say one would like to have seen an ideal scientific study, but we're dealing with human beings over a long period of time, and this is impossible.
In the end, the study confirmed existing data about the natural course of syphilis and found no evidence that syphilis differs from race to race, so-called negative results.
We hadn't really proven it.
Okay, we saw a little bit about the results here. We had no class on Wednesday. Remember, you're evaluating the whatever, I'm not sure what you're assessing. This class, the university, your courses, whatever. Friday, I am praying for all of you that you can pass my final, so you don't have class again Friday. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go look in your textbook the information on syphilis, gonorrhea, streptococcal infections, staphylococcal infections. We'll be doing some waterborne diseases in the laboratory this Tuesday and Thursday, as well as the analysis of water. Do you have any question about that video? It's almost over. Time is over. We'll talk about this on Monday when you get back. There are some things we need to point out about it. So go have a wonderful rest of the day.
I've got a psych test. I'd like to.
Yeah, were you not in class when we had that? Oh, okay. You have lab tomorrow? Yes. Right. Okay.
How do I get to your downtown?
Okay, who else has to take this test? Somebody else did. Maybe she knows where it is. You know, it's on the corner of, Jen, I want to talk to you. The corner of 6th Avenue and 9th Street. So just go down 6th Avenue to 9th Street, find a parking place, put a quarter, probably 2 quarters in the meter, because they get and I'll be there in just a few minutes. I have to drop something off
Okay,
at the
so
post
it's
office.
just...
It's in the Pritchard building,
Okay.
6th Avenue and 9th Street. Come in on the 9th Street side.
Okay.
And as soon as you come through the door, look to the left and you'll see microbiological consultants. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. I want to get you down and give you a tour of the lab and stuff and talk to you a little bit more about the thing. I'm pretty certain that we're going to get the thing. I talked to the people. So trying to think when would be a good day for you. Well, let's talk about next week. We'll come next week. This week's kind of a mess. I got people taking exams and I got church all day Friday and stuff. So
Okay, I do the schedule at Long John's.
Oh.
So after I do the schedule, I'll let you know what days I have off. And any day that I have off, I never do anything.
Okay, now you're going to be able to work about 30 hours a week, I know.
Yeah,
okay.
definitely, because I've been there for 4 years. So I can pretty much do whatever I
was like, yeah, sign me up.
I did that when my son was getting in a lot of trouble. It really does help.